Welcome, everyone. Good evening in London and good morning in the United States of America. We welcome our guest, Professor Rashid Khalidi. He is a professor of the Edward Said Studies, and he has written a number of books on Palestine and Israel and the Palestinian conflicts. And we welcome him here today with us. We're going to be discussing his book, The 100 Years War on Palestine, and which was released, when was it, sorry?
It was released in the UK, I believe, in February of 2020, and the paperback just came out in the United Kingdom.
Okay.
And it was released in the United States at the same time, actually, and the paperback is about to appear in the US.
Okay. And so one question I would have to ask regarding the book is, how did you come up with the idea to write it? What prompted you to write it? And how did you come up with the layout of the declaration of war? Because that's a very interesting topic. You know, it's a very unique way of writing history of any region, but especially that region. How did you come up with it, and especially the layout of the declarations of war?
Right. Well, I came up with this idea because I had been constantly urged by people like my son, Ismail, who said that I had written a number of monographs on Palestine, but I had not written anything for a general reader. I had not written anything that was accessible and easy to understand for people who are not specialists. So I was being pushed by him and others, friends and relatives, to do something that would lay out the struggle in Palestine in a way that was not solely intended for specialists. Why did I come up with the structure that I did? Has a lot to do with the false narratives about Palestine. The idea that this is a conflict between two peoples on an equal level, that is to say, the Israelis and the Palestinians are both on a level of equality, and it's a struggle between two national movements or two peoples. Well, that's one way of interpreting it, and there's an element of truth to that. But essentially, this conflict is a result of a war that has been waged on the Palestinian people, like every colonial war in the modern era, in order to implant a settler colonial project in their country. And so I laid that out. The title of the book is The 100 Years War on Palestine, a history of settler colonialism and resistance. And the idea was that the title and the structure of the book, various declarations of war, largely by international actors on the Palestinians, would replace this false narrative of two peoples, two right against right, or a nationalism against another nationalism, which pervades the largely mythical Israeli-inspired narrative of what's going on in Palestine.
Okay, that's an interesting perspective. And you mentioned in your book regarding the backers of Zionism. So Zionism and the colonial and the settler colonial project, it has backers such as the US, previously Britain, and others such as the Soviet Union. And you mentioned it's regarding how Zionism maybe cannot even survive without these backers. And you mentioned that that's still the case, you know, over 70 years on from the creation of Israel, and even more from the creation of the Zionist project. Right. It still has state backers. So do you think it could or could not survive without the help of the US or with other state backers?
Well, that is actually a central argument of the book, that this was always a war waged with international sanction, with international support, that the Zionist project was not something that succeeded solely because of the efforts of the Zionists themselves and later of the Israelis. Obviously, they were central to the story. Obviously, their efforts were enormously important. But without the Balfour Declaration, without the bayonets of the British Army, without 100,000 British troops and policemen suppressing the Palestinians in the 30s, the Zionist project could not and would not have been implanted successfully. That is a fact. Without the support of the United States, Israel would not and could not have acted successfully in war. Well, support of the United States and other powers earlier on, but most recently in the last several decades, the United States would not and could not have been as successful as it has been. So my answer to your question is yes, without links to Europe initially and continuing links to the EU, by which I mean Europe is the largest trading partner of Israel. Without the financial support that comes largely from the United States, but also from Europe. And by that, I do not solely mean the many billions of dollars a year that the US government sends Israel. I mean the many billions of dollars in tax-free donations that Israel is able to garner in the United States for things like support of the Israel Defense Forces, for things like settlements and illegal settlements in occupied territories. These are tax-free dollars sent from American donors because the American government supports this colonial project. So the answer to your question is yes. Israel, and before that, the project up until the establishment of the state in 1948, could not and would not have been either as successful or in some respects perhaps successful at all without this massive external support. This was true in the 20s and the 30s, and it's been true since the 60s, that this external support has been absolutely essential to the successes of Israel, not just on the battlefield, in every respect. Israel would be in a position that would be unsustainable in the international community were it not for the veto wielded by the United States in the Security Council. It is an international pariah, but for that veto. So the United States is the elemental, essential, basic safeguard of Israel against international pariahdom.
And do you think that the Palestinian factions, such as the PLO and now Fatah and also Hamas, do you think that they have failed to get state backers like Israel has? Do you think they failed in that way? Or?
Well, one of the things that I detail in this book is both the failures and the successes of the Palestinian national movement at different stages of this struggle. I talk about failures in the mandate period. I talk about failures in the more recent period by the Palestinian Authority, by the PLO, by Hamas. But I also talk about some of their successes. I think that it's a mistake to see this in an entirely negative light simply because the odds against the Palestinians were so heavily stacked. It really is important to understand what they were able to achieve in terms of the odds against them. I would say, however, that in the current era, the bankruptcy of all Palestinian political factions, the complete absence of a clear strategy going forward, and the institutions that have been created since the Oslo Accords is a major problem of the Palestinians and for the Palestinians to solve. In this new situation that the Palestinians find themselves after the Trump administration has given so many gifts to Israel, it's absolutely essential that the Palestinians not just unify, but that they determine a new long-term strategy. And I very much blame all of the existing leaderships for their failure to do that.
Yeah, and that also relates to what you mentioned in your book, that the Palestinian factions and groups have kind of failed to adapt to the contemporary political scene. How do you think that they could improve on that from your perspective? How would you say?
Well, I mean, one thing that they have to do is learn lessons of the past and understand what they've done wrong in order to do things better in the future. One of the lessons of the past is that the Palestinian national movement, during its heyday, after it was resurrected following the Nakba of 1948, during its heyday made a very successful appeal to Arab public opinion, to Muslim public opinion, and to international public opinion. And it didn't just talk to governments, it talked to peoples, it talked to civil society, it talked to churches, to synagogues, to mosques, to unions, to all kinds of institutions of civil society all over the world, garnering enormous international support for the Palestine cause in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. We forget those successes, and we forget that they were not just based on hobnobbing with heads of state or international diplomacy. They were based on a successful campaign to argue the case for Palestine, establish a Palestinian narrative, and to, in effect, show why the support for Israel was problematic. That could be done again. That should be done again. It's a tragic fact that today there is no Palestinian diplomacy in effect. Palestine doesn't have public diplomacy, except that is engaged in by Palestinian civil society. So the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign is not an effort of the so-called Palestinian Authority, an institution that has no authority, no jurisdiction, no sovereignty, no power. It's essentially a subsidiary of the Israeli occupation. It does not engage in diplomacy. I don't remember the last time that a Palestinian representative said anything that was ever reported anywhere. They are not there. They do not act. Whereas student groups, groups in civil society in Europe and the United States, linked to groups in civil society in Palestine, are very active in putting forward the case for Palestine. That has to be done much more energetically. And that's the first step. A second step is, and something that's related to this, is to have a strategy. What do you want? How can you explain that clearly to the Arab peoples? How can you explain that clearly to an international audience? We don't have anybody saying that because we don't have a strategy. Do we want one state? Do we want two states? What kind of campaign are we engaged in for Palestinian rights, national rights, individual rights, civil rights, human rights? All of these things have to be clarified. I'm completely open in terms of which approach should be followed, but you have to have an approach, and that has to be based on a national consensus, and that in turn has to be propagated actively, not just by hobnobbing with the Secretary of State or a foreign secretary or a president or a king, but via an aggressive campaign to put the Palestinian case before public opinion in different countries, which is simply not being done. It was done, to be fair. It was done effectively by the PLO. It was done somewhat less effectively by the Palestinian National Movement in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, quite ineffectively, actually. But they tried. It's not being done at all currently. And that is a tragic failure. The people who are in charge should be condemned for the dereliction of duty in terms of not putting what is a just case before international public opinion with all the energy that they have. And that should be a priority for the future.
Do you attribute that lack of diplomacy and the lack of people in the Palestinian political scene? Do you attribute that to the fact that many of them were sidelined, assassinated in Arab countries and other places? Do you attribute it to that, or is there like another reason?
So that's really a very, very good point. Israel has engaged, as all colonial powers do, in a systematic campaign to kill or jail or exile or sideline national leadership, by which I mean not just political leaders, I mean thought leaders, I mean intellectuals. The number of Palestinian intellectuals murdered by Israel, and in some cases by the intelligence services of Arab countries. I can mention Iraq under Saddam Hussein. I can mention the Syrian regime under Hafez al-Assad and his son. I can mention the Libyan regime. Dozens of Palestinian leaders, poets, representatives abroad, leaders of the PLO were murdered, mainly by Israeli assassination squads, but in many, many, many cases by agents of these Arab regimes. This is obviously a problem that every national movement faces. The South Africans had dozens of leaders killed by the apartheid regime. The French did the same in Algeria. Every colonial regime does something of this sort. Sometimes they jail them. There are currently hundreds and hundreds of Palestinian leaders in Israeli jails. Some of them are there for life. They will probably not be released in their lifetimes. So yes, of course, this is a disadvantage. But it's a disadvantage that the Palestinians simply will have to overcome, as did every people struggling for national liberation. This is not the only time that this has happened. I mean, Amilcar Cabral, the leader of the Guinea-Bissau national movement, was murdered by the Portuguese. So many South African leaders were murdered. One could go on and on and on. This is not a unique liability that the Palestinians suffer from. The Israelis are particularly efficient at it and boast about it. But other colonial powers did the same thing.
And moving on to the US political scene, or how it links in with it, we have today President Joe Biden being inaugurated today. his
In about
predecessor,
45 minutes, actually.
yeah. So his predecessor, Trump, former President Trump, he, as we know, he did many damages, you could say, to the Palestinian cause. You know, for example, he recognized the Golan Heights as Israeli, Jerusalem as the apparent as the apparent capital of Israel. Other things such as sidelining the Palestinian cause, his deal of the century, the normalization of Arab states. How much of that damage do you think will be there for long term? Do you think it can be recovered, or do you think it's irreparable, in your opinion?
That's a good question. I think that some of the damage done by the Trump administration may well be undone by the Biden administration. Mainly, I would have to say minor things. They're important, but they're minor. The cutoff of U.S. funding to UNRWA, which supports Palestinian refugees, will undoubtedly be reversed. The closing of the PLO office in Washington will undoubtedly be reversed. The closing of the U.S. consulate in Jerusalem that worked with the Palestinians there will probably be reversed. There will be a number of similar actions to undo some of the most egregious anti-Palestinian measures of the Trump administration. However, I think it should be said that the Biden administration represents the leadership faction of the Democratic Party, which is quite committed to most of the basic tenets of American support for Israel, as committed, I would say, as every administration that's preceded it. And so that in terms of the basics of American support for Israel, I don't think we're going to see much change. They will not be as egregiously anti-Palestinian, certainly. They will not be as tolerant, at least verbally, in terms of their public diplomacy, of Israeli settlements, of some Israeli human rights violations. They won't do anything about them, however, by which I mean they will not stop funding Israeli violations of international law of Palestinian human rights. The United States subsidizes the occupation. The United States pays for it. Almost $4 billion a year go to the Israeli military. What does the Israeli military do? It occupies Palestine. That's its job. I mean, it has other jobs, but its main job today and every day is to keep the Palestinians down. The United States subsidizes that. The tax-free donations from Americans, billions of dollars, tax-free, so-called charitable donations under a category called 501c3, flood into Israel. And they don't just subsidize hospitals and orphanages and so on. They subsidize settlements. They subsidize Israeli security. They subsidize the infrastructure of settlement and colonization. So the United States saying it opposes an Israeli action is less than meaningless. It's actually harmful. I would much rather have a Trump who says, yes, we want you to settle and we will pay for it, than an American administration that says, naughty, 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 don't settle, but we will pay for it. And we will help you to suppress the Palestinians when they resist your illegal actions. So I don't think that we can expect from the Biden administration a shift in the fundamental American support for Israel. We can certainly expect a change in terms of some of these important superficials. Let me say one more thing, which is that what the Palestinians do has an effect on this. Were the Palestinians able, and if they are hopefully able, to effectively put their case in the United States, there's an audience in Congress, there's an audience in American public opinion, there's an audience in American civil society that could carry that case to the Biden administration and force it to change some of these biases in favor of Israel towards more neutral, at least, policies. That is not outside the realm of possibility within this 4-year administration. Because you have today in Congress literally dozens and dozens and dozens of representatives, probably 2 or 3 dozen, who are committed to support of Palestinian rights in some form or other. That's the first time in U.S. history that that's ever happened. You've had individuals, most of whom were defeated immediately as a result of their taking a position in support of Palestinian rights. Today, you have dozens and dozens of people who, in many cases, ran on a platform which included support for Palestinian rights and who won their elections in spite of support for their opponents by the Israel lobby. Elliot Engel was defeated in a district just north of here. I'm in New York City. By a candidate who said, I support the Palestinians. And Engel is one of the greatest supporters of Israel ever to sit in the U.S. Congress. He was head of a major committee in the House of Representatives. And this has happened all over the United States. So when and if the Palestinians succeed in putting forward a clear roadmap for what they want, that will reinforce, I think, the existing trend that is developing in favor of support for Palestine among many, many people, college students, churches, liberal members of the Jewish community, and so on. People who are fed up with Israel's violations of international law and of Palestinian human rights.
Do you think that this shift in public opinion that we've seen, like you said, more support for Palestinian rights, do you think it will ever reach, let's say in the future, in the next few decades, do you think it would ever reach up to such a level as a presidency, or would the Israeli lobby and its hold on the US, do you think it would be so strong even then that it would prevent that from happening?
Let me say two things. First of all, I mean, I'm a historian. The job description of historian does not include predicting the future. I don't know what's going to happen. I couldn't possibly, things go up and things go down. This is a trend today. That trend could diminish. The opposition to Palestinian rights is more ferocious in the United States and more highly funded by the tens of millions of dollars. They have hot and cold running lawyers struggling to shut down activism on behalf of Palestine. So nothing is inevitable. I will say, however, that it is very, very clear that there is a trend, and this is a favorable trend, and that this trend could well continue, and that the hold of the Israel lobby over American politics is not something arcane. It's something that is a result of generations of serious, hard work by dedicated, committed individuals who, since the beginning of the Zionist movement in the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, have been working in the United States to build up support, create a narrative, and so on and so forth. David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, and the second president of Israel, were exiled by the Ottoman authorities during World War I. They came to New York. They spent years in New York City and in different parts of the United States building up the Zionist movement. We're talking over 100 years ago. So what you see in terms of a lobby in Congress, what you see in terms of influence on the media, is not the result of some conspiracy. It's not the result of some arcane hold over people. It's the result of hard work within the American system by intelligent people who knew what they were doing, understood the levers of power. And I think that's beginning to be the case for the movement for Palestinian rights. We're beginning to see people who have strategic sense. We're beginning to see people who are extremely effective on the level of the academy, publications in the academy, on the level of student activism, on the level of churches, and now, for the first time, really, on the political level. I mean, we literally have dozens, 2 or 3 dozen, members of Congress who are supportive of Palestinian rights. And that's a result of hard work over a couple of generations. It's going to take time. This is not something there's no magic bullet. You don't go and you talk to the president and suddenly the president changes his or, inshallah, her mind one day and you win over everybody. No, that doesn't happen. Politicians look at reality. Barack Obama once said, I can't do this because you haven't pushed me hard enough. Well, we have to push them hard enough. And that requires the kind of ceaseless, unending effort to build up a movement within the United States, which the Zionist movement did successfully. And they're not the only people to do it. Civil rights movement did the same thing. It took them centuries, from slavery to Jim Crow to civil rights to today, and it's still not ended, as you can see with Black Lives Matter. This is not something that in a few years can happen. It's not even something that can happen in a couple of generations. But I think there's a possibility, certainly, of it's happening.
And moving on quickly to the phenomenon of Arab normalization, the Arab states normalizing ties with Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco, etc. This only seems to be spreading. There are rumors that Saudi Arabia would do it. There are rumors that other Arab states, or what's left, would do it. What Arab states do you think, if there is, obviously the Palestinian cause, I think you mentioned before in your book and other interviews, the Palestinian cause should be separate from any Arab state or regime. However, if you had to say there is one that the Palestinians could most rely on, which one would you say it would be?
I actually wouldn't like to say. Let me say three things. The first is that the Palestine cause is still supported by overwhelming majorities of Arab public opinion, in spite of the fact that the Palestinian national movement is in a state of total disarray and has utterly failed to appeal to Arab public opinion. This is one of many failures that has to be hung around the necks of the entire generation of leadership. They have failed to do something that earlier generations did. Even the not very effective leadership in the 20s and the 30s was very successful in publicizing the Palestinian cause on an Arab and Islamic level. That was also true of the PLO. That is not true of these folks. In spite of their utter failure, the Palestine cause is still popular. There are opinion polls that are issued by the Arab Research Center in Qatar, and they have an office here in Washington, which show that year in, year out, support for the Palestinians among people in a dozen Arab countries is very, very high. The Palestinians have simply failed to capitalize on that. So that's the first point. The second point is the countries that have normalized with Israel, for the most part, have just taken public relationships that were private. The Bahraini, the Emirati, and the Moroccan governments certainly have always been closely tied to Israel over at least a decade or two. In fact, in the case of Morocco, King Hassan's security services were trained by the Israelis 50 years ago. So what are we talking about in terms of normalization? There are charter flights between Israel and Morocco and have been for decades. Israel had a diplomatic office in the Emirates, in Morocco, in other countries in the Gulf for many, many years. They were then closed down, but surreptitiously, those connections have continued, especially on the level of security. The anti-missile defenses of the Emirates are insured by a company which operates under the name of Raytheon, which is an American corporation, but which is based in Israel. The Israelis provide the anti-missile defenses of the Emirates and have for years and years and years. So when we talk about normalization, they already had normal relations. The only difference is they were surreptitious and they have now become public. Why? Because the Trump administration offered massive bribes to each of the countries that engaged in this process to publicly come out with a relationship that had in most cases been secret. That's not the case with Sudan, but it was the case with Morocco, Bahrain, and the Emirates. Each of these, they offered different bribes. In the case of Morocco, it was recognizing the Moroccan position on the Western Sahara. In the case of the Emirates, it was to offer them F-35 fighter bombers. In the case of, each country had a different bribe. Sudan taking them off the terrorism list and giving them access to billions of dollars in credits. So the Trump administration spent American diplomatic capital in order to facilitate Israel's expansion in the Arab world in fields where it already was present, it must be said. The last thing I'll say, and this is also important to say, is that I don't think you can blame people in Arab countries that are the victims of civil wars, countries like Syria, countries like Iraq, countries like Libya, countries like Yemen, which are torn apart by international intervention and by civil strife, for not putting Palestine at the top of their list. If your country is being destroyed and a quarter or a third of your population is suffering from hunger, as in Yemen, or are refugees, as in Syria, or are being torn apart, as in Libya, or one could go on and on. In those places, there's no possibility of people prioritizing Palestine over survival. The second problem is that most Arab governments are non-democratic. They do not allow the expression of their people's opinion. In countries where there is a greater degree of free expression, countries like Tunisia, countries like Lebanon, countries like Kuwait, where there's a parliament and a free press, support for Palestine is widespread. And those governments are not under any circumstances going to move towards normalization with Israel because the people won't let them. Whereas in a jackboot dictatorship or in an absolute monarchy in Egypt or Saudi Arabia, public opinion, they have to worry about the rulers. But ultimately, they do whatever they think they can get away with.
And one last question. This year, there will be elections between the Palestinian factions, Hamas and Fatah, in May.
Inshallah. We hope.
Yeah, inshallah. In May and July, I believe. What do you think, broadly speaking, what do you think the outcome would be? Do you think that there is a hope for reconciliation if they do take place?
I don't know if they will take place. I hope that they do. And I hope that there will be a reconciliation, simply because the squabbling between these two factions is disgraceful at a time of national distress and crisis, that these people are more worried about the political advantages they currently enjoy, rather than the fate of the Palestinian people. It's a disgrace. They should all be condemned for their maintenance of this conflict over more than almost a decade and a half, since the 2006 elections. That's a first step towards Palestinian unity, towards a Palestinian consensus, and towards a coherent Palestinian strategy. But it's a baby step if it takes place. This is a conflict that should not exist. Palestinians are all agreed on the need to liberate their country. Palestinians are all agreed on the need to end not just occupation, but the whole settler colonial process, of which occupation is only a part. They have differences on how to do this. They have differences on what their ultimate aims are. And those are things that a Palestinian consensus has to develop around. And so a reconciliation followed by elections is a first step in that direction. But it's only a first step. Palestinians have to decide what they want. Palestinians have to decide, to be very blunt, Palestinians have to decide how they're going to live with the other people that has established itself in their land. Palestinians understand Palestine as belonging to them. But whether we like it or not, the settler colonial project has created another people in Palestine, just like the settler colonial project has created another people in the country I live in, the United States. The United States is a reality. I don't like the way in which the Native American population of the country was destroyed. I don't like the way in which it was created. It was a horrible process, like all settler colonialisms, but it has created a new national entity. And that's also the case in Israel, whether you like it or not. And most Palestinians understand that perfectly well, especially the ones living under occupation. They know that Israel is, in one form or another, at least in terms of as a people, is a reality. How do you relate to that reality? Via a two-state solution, via a one-state democratic solution, via cantons, however, it doesn't really matter. It matters, but that's not the point at this stage. It's to figure out on a consensus basis how Palestinians want to struggle for a specific aim that they can ultimately achieve. And this reconciliation and hopefully, inshallah, elections would be a first step in that direction.
Yeah, let's hope inshallah goes ahead. And for those who haven't read your book, for those viewers who haven't yet read his book, I would really recommend it for many reasons, but also the topic you just mentioned, Professor Khalidi, about the Palestinian leadership. You really go into a lot of detail about the early Palestinian leadership, how it developed, the conflicts between them, how they were ignited by the foreign powers. So that's one of the main interesting things that you go into detail on. And just to wrap up, could you tell people where you could possibly find your book or purchase it?
A paperback is available in the UK, in the United States, and in many countries around the world. An Arabic translation is about to come out. It's available in India. It's available in China, or will soon be. Translations are underway in China and Taiwan and Korea. So globally, people can find the book.